Hello everybody and welcome back to OMB Reviews. I am the critic who is a cynic. Hope you're doing well. Today we'll be doing a box office breakdown for this past weekend, which saw the Barbie film finally pass $1 billion. This only after 17 days of release. This is actually now beating out the Harry Potter film, Harry Potter Deathly Hallows Part 2, which up to this point had the fastest to reach $1 billion, or one of the fastest to reach $1 billion from a Warner Brothers release. That one had 19 days to do that very same thing. So the fact that this Barbie film, especially with all the crap that's in the story for this film, that it's done so is still very, very impressive. There's just no way about it. So we'll see what Becca over at Variety has to say about that. We also, of course, have the box office for this past weekend for the Meg 2, The Trench, Oppenheimer, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Mutant Mayhem, and also the second weekend numbers for Haunted Mansion. And let's just say that even though things are looking really good for Barbie, not looking really good at all for Disney, and that is something I think ultimately to be celebrated. Before we get any further, please make sure you smash that like button, light that fire button, Aussie, and smash the rumble button as well. And also make sure that you are subscribed to the channel with that bell notification on. That way you know every time a video or live stream goes live on the channel. So thank you all for putting up with my garbage voice on Friday for the box office preview. It is now a lot better, as you can hear. Still on the mend, but definitely a lot better than what it was. But as you can see, Becca over at Variety says the Greta Gerwig film is the first $1 billion release solely helmed by a female director. Ah, yes, all about that empowerment from Variety. Can't say I'm that surprised. If you're wondering why I'm using Variety and not Nance over at Deadline, as of the recording of this video, there was not an update to her global box office. I just refreshed it, and I cannot currently find it. That does not mean that it's not out there. As we all know, I've at times had to find and had to dig my way through to try to find her analysis on the international box office. But don't worry, we do still have Tony over at Deadline, who actually was on time this morning. So as you can see from Variety, let's dive into this article. Barbie is saying hiya to the $1 billion club. Greta Gerwig's pink-coated fantasy comedy, I think we could definitely stress the fantasy element of that, has surpassed $1 billion at the global box office, including $459 domestic and $572 million internationally. That alone is very impressive. I thought that this movie was going to be a much stronger domestic performer than international, just based on the typical audience for the Barbie IP, but apparently it has also been very effective internationally as well, even more so, right? 572 versus 459, even though that's still pretty close to itself, it's definitely a lot wider of a chasm between them than I thought it was ever going to be. You then go on, Becca over at Variety then goes on to say that the other billion-dollar blockbusters where women were involved in the director's chair were only co-directed by women, and so therefore it doesn't count. Again, this is the world that we live in today. Frozen, $1.3 billion. Frozen 2 at $1.4 billion. And then Captain Marvel, which made $1.1 billion, also was co-directed by a woman. And we all know that whether it's a man or a woman behind the camera, guess what? That does not result in box office at all. Again, there's been several flops directed by women and by men. In fact, you could even argue that there's been more flops directed by men. One of those things that typically doesn't come up in the conversation about quote-unquote equality, but again, at that point, I also digress. Barbie is hitting the coveted milestone after just 17 days of release, becoming the fastest Warner Brothers release. So again, within its history to join the $1 billion club, Harry Potter, and the Deathly Hallows Part 2 previously held the record at 19 days. It goes on to say, thanks to the zeitgeist-smashing buzz, Barbie has remained #1 at the box office for 3 consecutive weekends, beating out the Meg 2, TMNT, Mutant Mayhem, and even Oppenheimer. It's already the second highest grossing film of 2023, and I do think that the film will end up being the highest grossing film of this year when everything is said and done. It's not as over $1 billion as I thought it was going to be. I thought it might be closer to $1.1 billion by the end of this weekend, but it did not quite speed up that much, or did not quite hold nearly as much as I thought. It's still doing very well, and the holds are still very strong, especially domestically. And it just has to be said. It has to be pointed out because at this point in time, it is a clear fact. Barbie is also only the second blockbuster this year and the 6th of the pandemic era to cross $1 billion. So this is now in the same company as Spider-Man No Way Home, Top Gun Maverick, Jurassic World Dominion, and Avatar The Way of Water. I just do think it's worthy of pointing out that, yeah, Jurassic World Dominion did eke out $1 billion, and that film was terrible. So once again, just because you make $1 billion does not mean that your film is good. They have a lot of things to thank. Most principally, the Barbie film has the marketing campaign for the film to thank for it, and the seemingly, again, as I said, I think the right word there is indeed zeitgeist, but specifically within the Gen Z and Gen Y female demographic that are the ones going out and supporting this movie in droves with all of their friends. Going over to Tony over at Deadline, he's going to talk about the domestic box office here as he talks about this $6 billion billion so far has been made by the domestic box office this year, and much of that is indeed thanks to films like Barbie, like Super Mario Brothers, like Oppenheimer. And this movie overall, this weekend overall, was actually very strong for everything involved. You had a very strong race for that second place spot, and Oppenheimer has officially been demoted from the second place spot. It still came in a very strong third place, so technically you could say the Barbenheimer effect in its full capacity of that 1-2 punch has officially been broken as of this weekend. Now, it is still close enough to where when the actuals come out on Monday or Tuesday, you might see some movement, but something tells me that the Meg 2 will probably end up keeping that number 2 spot, but Meg 2 has its own problems when you actually look at the data and you look at the numbers and where those numbers are coming from, even though it definitely had a stronger than expected opening weekend domestically, more so than anything else. As it says right here, as the Hollywood labor stoppage continues, that's one way of saying it, the 2023 box office rally rages on as domestic soars to $6 billion, which is 22% over the same time frame from last year. And again, what has come out since that time that would have been different? Whereas last year had a film like Top Gun Maverick, this year we have a film like Barbie, which is definitely right now on pace to do very similar numbers in certain areas as Top Gun Maverick. It's also doing like for the Super Mario Brothers movie, which was also earlier this year, a very impressive box office, also getting to $1 billion in its own right. It goes on, this weekend for all movie stands at an estimated $178 million. This is the fourth time in box office history to have 4 movies cross $25 million. The last time was Thanksgiving weekend of 2018. Now, as you all know, they don't adjust their numbers for inflation, and so that very well could not necessarily be the case. That does not mean that the same number of ticket sales were available on all of these given weekends, but what we can say is this is definitely one of the most impressive weekends that we have seen, really, since that first opening weekend for Barbenheimer. I think that what we're seeing from this is there seems to be some life in the box office, but it also, as Tony brought up in the very beginning, it does raise that giant elephant in the room, which is the writers and actors strike. If those continue to delay and push back certain films and certain releases, guess what? That means that this rallying that you're seeing right now at the box office could ultimately end up being stopped. There is no guarantee that this rally would even continue if the releases stayed the same, because those habits have really not been fully reformed yet. I think there are certain films out right now that are driving certain demographics of people out to go see movies, but that does not guarantee that even if you kept those films on your release schedule, that anything would necessarily stay the same or change. But I definitely know that if you don't have these movies out at their specific release time, and if you don't have several options of films to go see, as we see right now, there is a plethora of options in the theater right now. I don't think there's a lot of great options, but there are options nonetheless. If you don't have that at all, then guess what? You're asking people to stay home, and that will just cause further damage. We always knew this weekend would beat the first frame of August a year ago, which was at $92 million, and that's happening at 94%. So that's a very impressive number there for it, no doubt about it. Barbie remains box office queen bee with $53 million in weekend 3 after a $17 million Friday and $20 million Saturday. So again, very, very impressive numbers there. Now, diving into the actual numbers at thenumbers.com, we can see that Barbie, indeed, with that $53 million, makes it the number one film at the box office again. But what's even more impressive to me is that percentage. So in the third week of its release, it has now dropped only 43%. So what we're seeing from this film is drops in the 40s. And this is the reason why I think that this film will end up being able to leg out a movie like the Super Mario Brothers movie, and could even give a film like Top Gun Maverick a run for its money in the worldwide box office. Because if it has holds like this, even though we have not yet seen as impressive of a week 1 to week 2 hold as we saw with Top Gun Maverick last year. If you all remember, that was in like the teens, low 20s. We have not seen that from a movie like this. We're still seeing solid holds, right? When you're dropping in the 30s, the 40s, you are seeing numbers that are going to end up being towards the top end of typical projections. As we all know, we love doing charting here at OMB Reviews, and we talked about this last week, where this movie has the potential to do quite a bit of money, right? On the low end, if the film had pretty massive drops, right, saw a lot of typical drops that you see for bigger budgeted movies in the 70% range, you would have seen this film still being able to make $1.1 billion. Since we're seeing drops in the 40s, that means the chances of it getting to that $1.4, $1.5 plus billion becomes that much more likely. And especially since this film is doing a much better internationally than I think anyone ever thought it could, that is good news for the film as far as its overall legs are concerned. The Meg 2 is going to be in a very different boat. I did find it interesting that the Warner Brothers releases this year in the number 1 and number 2 spot for this weekend at least are both co-financed movies. Barbie being co-financed by Warner Brothers and Mattel, Meg 2 being co-financed by not only Warner Brothers but also a Chinese company. And that is going to be the reason why, even though Meg 2 is doing better than it probably has any right to do, and it's doing better than I think anyone would have expected its opening weekend to be. The film still cost enough to where it's got a long way to go before it creates any real profit for Warner Brothers. And there's a couple reasons as to why that is, which we'll get into when we look at the full numbers internationally. But let's just say the Meg 2 has a major China problem, and we'll talk about that. Coming in the number 3 spot, so finally getting knocked out of the number 3 spot after 2 weeks at the number 2 spot. Oppenheimer being dropped out of the number 2 spot after 2 weeks solidly being there without really any competition whatsoever, has finally been dropped by the Meg 2. Oppenheimer, though, still coming in a strong number 3 finish. And as you can see, the difference between the Meg 2, Oppenheimer, and Mutant Mayhem are very, very close to each other. So when those actuals come out for the weekend, either Monday or Tuesday, we could see at least one, maybe even two of those movies switch, right? If Mutant Mayhem had a stronger Sunday than what had been thought, hey, that would push that film up. If Oppenheimer had a weaker Sunday, that could drop it down. And again, this could go for any of those 3 movies. But hey, that is still very impressive nonetheless that all of them are above $25 million, as was being said in the previous article. But do not be surprised to see Oppenheimer go back into the number 2 spot potentially, or at the very least be in that same ballpark as the Barbie film as far as being, again, right next to each other, whether it be the 1-2 or the 2-3 spot. The reason why is because look at that drop. Oppenheimer only dropped 39%. It's already impressive enough that this film is a 3-hour drama and it's doing as well as it is. It's even more impressive that 3 weeks out, we're still seeing those kinds of holds. And so because of that, do expect Meg 2 to have 65% plus drop next week, because this seems to be the kind of film that typically has those kinds of drops after an opening weekend, especially a bigger than expected opening. And there isn't a lot of positive press surrounding that movie right now. And I think that what that will ultimately lead to is Oppenheimer being able to take over that Meg 2 position. Now, whether or not there's going to be a brand new release next weekend that will be able to take the number 1, number 2 spot from it is anyone's guess. We'll have to, of course, do a box office preview next weekend, looking at anything set to come out. But it is still definitely a possibility to see Oppenheimer once again either get the number 2 spot or at the very least be right next to where Barbie is, as they've had very similar drops percentage-wise, even though the box office has been much stronger for Barbie. Again, Oppenheimer has had a strong box office, but not nearly as strong as Barbie's has been. Mutant Mayhem at $27.9 million. Definitely, I don't think as big maybe as what could have been a potential. Like, again, when you think about family movies these days, and you're seeing box office numbers like that, it makes you kind of wonder what this film would have made, prior to the pandemic, right? Because now families need to have movies that actually look good, that actually look like they're entertaining, that don't feel like they're trying to preach or trying to shove something down, their kids' throats. And if you know anything about the Mutant Ninja Turtles in general, and you saw this trailer, you already knew, wait a minute, this is supposed to be April O'Neil. This is clearly an agenda item right here that you're trying to push. And apparently they have also decided to make certain choices when it comes to the characterization and the, quote, sexuality of Splinter. And again, I'm sure everyone and their mother was like, yeah, let's go ahead and delve into that a little bit further. Again, I think that once you have stuff like that coming out, it could ultimately impact the movie. It only cost $70 million to make, though, so there's still a good chance for the film to make its money back. But hey, if the film has massive drops, maybe we see something else happen. But as of right now, I think it's in a comfortable position to be able to make its money, but definitely not going to be a huge money maker when everything is said and done. Haunted Mansion from Disney, speaking of not money makers, but money losers, Haunted Mansion at a 63% drop. So it's now its second weekend of release. So this is the kind of drop off I could expect to see from a film like The Meg 2. Even though Haunted Mansion has actually gotten some decent word of mouth, it's clear that Disney is the one studio, or seemingly the one studio, that cannot figure out the box office. Even when it comes to Warner Brothers, they had Barbie. They had a massive marketing campaign, a successful one, and that movie has just run the races. When it comes to all the Disney releases, though, we've just not seen it. Even the biggest box office that they've had so far this year, which would have to go, we'd have to probably look at The Little Mermaid as being one of their biggest box office makers, because they spent so much money on that movie, it didn't make them any money. They're still looking at a financial loss for The Little Mermaid. When it comes to Haunted Mansion, they spent $150 million on it. So not only are we seeing these types of drops that pretty much are a death knell for a movie like this, but also because they spend so much, there's just not even a chance. There's not even an opportunity for them to make any money back on their investments. So Disney is just in a very, very bad state right now. And we'll go further into that when we actually look at the individual numbers for Haunted Mansion. But let's just say Disney is in a bad position. Couldn't happen to a nicer company. Sound of Freedom from Angel Studios, despite the media, including Tony at Deadline, trying to, have this movie in the same expression and have it in the same headline as something completely irrelevant to the movie itself. For those that don't know, there's now been a story going around about how someone, they have that pay it forward campaign where you can buy, or basically all you're doing is putting money into a pool where if someone wants to claim a free ticket, they then get access to the money in that pool so they can buy a ticket for themselves. Some people wrongly think that the pool is just buying random tickets, but that's not really what's happening. But one of the random persons, right, there's over 6,000 people who have donated to that fund. Apparently one of them has been arrested for something. And even though the arrest seems to be pretty dubious when the details of it come out, it still doesn't matter, right? Even if the person had done something terrible, guess what? When were these articles? When was Deadline? When were any of these people obsessed with random people being arrested for different things? I mean, even Tony at Deadline has to admit the facts, which is, hey, this person had nothing to do with the making of the movie. This person had nothing to do with financing the production of the film. This was just a random person who decided to fund to a campaign online. And it's like, wait a minute, are we honestly going to start doing that? Because something tells me that Tony at Deadline probably wouldn't be digging nearly in as much when it comes to the other films in Hollywood that get funded and some of the sources of the money that might be, right? Again, it makes you ask the question about why Tony and why so many people in the media are trying to run with these narratives that are clearly trying to make less people want to support a film like Sound of Freedom. It does make you wonder. It does make you ask questions. Tony, amongst many others. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1 dropped to the number 7 spot, dropping only 39%. So as I've mentioned previously, it also dropped from a crap ton of theaters, another 700 plus dropping there, and still only a 39% drop. The movie is actually holding well for the theaters that it has available. As you can see, the per theater ratio there is actually even a little bit higher than what Sound of Freedom's currently is. Now, that still does mean ultimately that this movie has a long way to go to ever hope to break even, and I don't think that's going to happen. But if you actually look at the numbers, you are seeing something that I said was probably going to happen, which was that this movie was going to have much stronger legs than what the initial 2 weeks would have given us. It's still not going to be enough, right? This movie's not going to be a hit. This movie's not going to make massive profits or anything like that. It's not even going to break even, but it's definitely going to get a lot closer than what I think anyone would have suspected it to do, especially with how poorly it's done in the build up to it. And it's still kind of amazing to me that the movie is doing as badly as it is, because it got amazing reviews, it got massive word of mouth, and I just think that ultimately it comes down to the way they released the film. People can argue about, hey, you should have released it earlier, July 4th. You could have gone up against Dial of Destiny, and that would have been a massive win for you. But those are things that we see now in hindsight in 2020, right? Those are things that we can ultimately see, and we can make some guesses about. But I do still think that the bigger problem for the film was the weird week-long release, foregoing a Thursday typical release and things like that. I think that probably ended up hurting the film more so than anything else. But again, that's an argument for another day. Talk to Me from A24, one of the first films from A24 to get a somewhat normal release schedule, has dropped only 40%, so very impressive numbers there for that indie horror film. Indiana Jones Dial of Destiny being dropped from almost 1,000 screens, so Disney clearly giving up on this movie. This movie still set to be a massive, massive flop for Disney, but hey, kudos where kudos are due. Elemental, still a flop, but not nearly as big of a flop as what it could have been. We were initially looking at Elemental as being a $200+ million flop. Right now, we're looking at it probably being closer to 50 to 100 million. Now, that's still a flop. That's still losing money. But when you look at where it is today compared to its first 2 weeks, it's actually pretty impressive. I'll try to remember that when we pull up the chart for the movie because, yeah, again, it's definitely still a flop for them, and Disney is in a lot of bad financial waters at this point in time, with their movies especially, but it still has to be said. Looking over at thenumbers.com, as you can see, Barbie has officially crossed the $1 billion mark. $459 million domestic, $551 million according to thenumbers.com. They recently updated these numbers, and the numbers has been having a lot of issues. It seems that a lot of people, more so than recent times, have finally found more interest in box office numbers, and that's probably why we're seeing the site crash so often, especially this close to when they release their numbers. You might need to start investing in some new servers, people, because again, this is the kind of thing you don't typically want to see on your website. But we saw it was indeed at $1 billion. I was able to load this up before it started having issues, and this is to compare it between a couple other movies. So Super Mario Brothers and Top Gun Maverick, both of those $1 billion films. Top Gun Maverick at $1.5 billion, Super Mario around $1.3 billion. Again, these are very impressive numbers here. But now we're talking about Barbie. Barbie costing around the same amount of money as Super Mario Brothers, a lot less than even Top Gun Maverick. But what's interesting here is the fact that when you look at the domestic versus international, you are probably going to end up seeing Barbie get somewhat close to where the international numbers were for Top Gun Maverick and also for Super Mario Brothers in that $700 million range. To me, the big question mark is going to be not only when does it pass Super Mario at 459, I think it will definitely pass that 574 made by Super Mario and be the biggest domestic release of this year. But when it comes to Top Gun Maverick, I don't necessarily think it will have enough gas in the tank to get to the $718 million that was made by Maverick. But hey, I could be wrong on that, because if you look at the current tracking and you look at the current comparisons, Barbie is still doing really, really well. If you go ahead and see the third Sunday numbers here, right, the projections are that it makes $20 million on its third Saturday and $16 million on its third Sunday versus the $19.6 million made by Super Mario Brothers and the $17.5 made by Top Gun Maverick. At the same point of release, Top Gun Maverick was only at $395. But remember, at $395 versus even the $436 of Super Mario, this movie went on to do $700 million domestic. Super Mario went on to make just $574, or roughly around that amount. So keep that in mind, that even though Maverick is currently behind both of these movies, it did end up beating out Mario, and it's still losing to Mario in that head-to-head matchup. The interesting thing is going to be, where does Barbie fall? Does Barbie follow a similar route? As you can see right now on third Saturday to third Sunday, Mario actually beats that out. It actually made more money on those days. So with that 436 versus 459, Barbie has the edge, but are we going to see Barbie continue those kinds of numbers and end up getting to a little over where the Mario film ended, getting closer to $600 million domestic? Or do we see it leg out to an insane level and get to numbers similar to that of Top Gun Maverick, getting all the way again to $700+ million? Now, this stopped tracking after the 10th Thursday. As you can see, by the 10th Thursday, Super Mario was done domestically. But by that 10th Thursday, this film, Top Gun Maverick, was still making over $1 million a day. And that's why it went on well past 10 weeks, still adding millions upon millions of dollars. Add to that the fact that Barbie is being currently run by Warner Brothers, and Warner Brothers is notorious for putting their movies out on PVOD and available on Max a lot earlier than their competitors. Top Gun Maverick had Tom Cruise behind it, and Tom Cruise is all about theaters, is all about having a film in theaters as long as possible. I don't know what kind of deals Warner Brothers made about this movie. They thought it was probably going to make money, but remember, even Warner Brothers only thought that the opening weekend was going to be $75 million and not the $162 million that it ended up making. So if Warner Brothers had very little confidence, or not nearly as much confidence as they probably should have had in Barbie, and just based that off of their own projections for their own movie, it does make me ask the question, and I wonder if anyone has the answer: have they made any deals so that it will be available on PVOD at a certain time frame? They've had very short theatrical windows because their films have typically done really, really bad. This is the first time that they've actually had a pretty big hit on their hands. So that could ultimately do a couple things. One, it could ultimately impact where this film ends up versus Super Mario Brothers and Top Gun Maverick in the domestic market. And two, it could also end up impacting the total worldwide gross for the film if they are taking it out of theaters because they're deciding to put it onto PVOD. The film is still a massive success. It is still making massive profits, but it is going to be an interesting line to follow as the course of the film's release continues. The Meg 2, as I mentioned earlier, this film has a China problem. At $142 million worldwide, $30 million of that comes from the domestic market. Of that $112 million internationally, the vast majority of that is coming from China. I believe the number is roughly around $70 million or so. As you all know, the numbers does not update their overall charts for the individual country releases there. But we do know that this film, as a co-produced movie in China, has made a huge amount of money in that market. Again, roughly $70 million. So we're talking about the vast majority of its entire box office, let alone its international, is coming from one country. You then have to remember that when it comes to China, they only get 25% of the box office receipts from that country. So when you really break things down, you realize that Warner Brothers is not likely to make a ton of money off of this movie. Even if they hit a break-even point, even if they are able to make the money they spent back, they're still co-financing this movie with a Chinese company, which means they're still going to be splitting any revenue, any profits they make with that Chinese company. You add to that the fact that that Chinese company is getting that 50% cut, and then also from their Chinese cut specifically, they're only getting 25% of the box office. Yeah, it means that the numbers might seem a lot stronger on paper, and the film could end up putting $150 million plus performance from China. But when you remember that only 25% of that is actually going to go to the studios, and then you have to split that between the two, yeah, let's just say the Meg 2 might end up still losing them money, even though the overall number seems to be a lot stronger than what it actually is. Oppenheimer is a very different scenario, though. Oppenheimer, again, I don't quite understand or believe they only spent $100 million on this movie, but hey, that's what they've reported so far. But at well over $500 million, the film is doing very, very well. And this film still has a lot of gas in the tank, could end up getting upwards of not just $600 million, but we're talking, what, 700, 750 being a possibility at the very least. TMNT Mutant Mayhem at $51 million, again, at only a $70 million budget, so it's doing okay. But again, probably not as well as they would have hoped for the movie. Haunted Mansion at $59 million is yet another flop for Disney. Sound of Freedom, 163. Chances of this film being able to continue to add to its profits seem very, very strong. $200 million is not out of the realm of possibility, but maybe getting closer to that 175 plus number by the end of its run. We'll have to wait and see, as it is still making money every single day. Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, still one of the worst titles you can give to a movie. As I said, doing much better than I think would have been expected. And I know some people are probably going to say, you're trying to rewrite things. No, I'm saying this movie should have been a massive hit. It wasn't. It's not making the money, but it is still lagging out to such a degree that the box office charting, and I think that will indicate that, is indicating the film will indeed make a lot more than what had initially been thought. It's still going to lose money in the long run, but not nearly as much as what had once been thought. Talk to Me from A24 is just adding to its profits, and Dial of Destiny, which has been pulled from yet another massive swath of theaters, will probably not get anywhere close to $400 million when everything is said and done. And seeing that the film costs roughly $400 million, depending on the sources that you look at, and once we get those UK tax numbers next year, we find out how much they actually spent, oh boy, this movie is probably the biggest box office flop, if not in history, then one of the biggest flops in box office history. Let's go ahead and talk about box office charting, because we love charting here over at OMB Reviews. So first off, now that we do have these numbers for Haunted Mansion, let's talk about why this film is in trouble. All right, so Haunted Mansion made $85 million so far. Made $59 million so far in the first 2 weeks. Using typical historical standards, that means the film will probably see somewhere between $85 and $119 million worldwide by the end of its run. The film cost $150 million to make. That means based on these numbers, the film will lose somewhere between $153 and $173 million. This is another massive disappointment for Disney. Disney has not had this year any major hits, has not had any major successes. As I've talked about, all these other studios have at least one movie that they can go to. Really, other than Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, you could still argue it made money, but even using the more conservative 2.5 multiplier, it's $132 million after they spent $250 million just on the budget of the movie. So yes, you've made your money back and you made profit, but you haven't even made enough to pay for another Guardians film based on the amount that you paid, let alone getting into what they likely spent on the marketing costs. So we're talking about a small amount of profit compared to budget, and possibly, if you look at a much more rigorous break-even point of closer to 3 times, a very small amount of profit, if even, right? So that is really the best thing they have going for it so far this year. That's just not good. That is not a good place for it to be, especially when its other massive releases so far this year are seeing pretty big losses, right? So again, more conservatively, Little Mermaid's looking at $36 million in the red, probably going to end up being closer to $75, $100 million in the red when everything is said and done for its box office release. Yeah, it might be able to make some of that back up on Blu-ray and 4K sales and maybe some streaming rights, but that film's on Disney Plus, right? That film is not going to end up paying for as much as you would see from another studio that does not have its own streaming service, or at the very least can offer it out internationally, as is the case with a film like Dead Reckoning Part 1. That will get some money back on streaming rights being sold, because internationally Paramount Plus is not as available in certain markets. You then look to other films like Dial of Destiny, right? We're looking at almost close to probably north of $400 million in financial losses when everything is said and done, right? This current number, 378, is based off of the budget being closer to $400 million. And I think that we can probably safely say that the film cost about that amount of money based on what we have seen with films like Doctor Strange 2 coming back, finding out the film cost $100 million more than what initially had been thought. So yeah, again, very, very bad news for Disney, and Haunted Mansion is yet another massive financial failure for them, and they're looking at yet another $150 million loss for that film. Talk to Me. We could also talk about the box office for this movie. Again, after having had a pretty strong start, especially on a $4.5 million budget, probably going to end somewhere between $13 and $21 million in profits. So again, not massive profits, but compared to what they spent, they're making a pretty decent amount of return on investment there, and so kudos to them for being able to actually do so, making more and more money. money. TMNT Mutant Mayhem, even though the film probably will end up breaking even, I don't think it's going to be a massive moneymaker based on the numbers that we're currently seeing. And as I mentioned with the Meg 2, we're looking at these numbers, and I think that you're going to ultimately see as to why this film may not be as healthy as it might be indicated. A big part of it is because the vast majority of their money is coming from China, and they also happen to be produced by a Chinese company. And that means they're going to have to be splitting revenues there. So when you're already splitting money with the Chinese Communist Party in China, and then you're also having to split that even more with your co-financer of the movie, oh boy, yeah, I think that this film could actually end up being in a lot bigger trouble than what might be indicated by the numbers in front of us. But these are the numbers as they currently stand. So again, if you want further data, go check out my website, ombreviews.com. As you can see, Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning right now is at $138 million. And so this is what I was going to talk about before. Right now, compared to its first 2 weeks, it's at 75%. So this movie is making enough to where this film will probably fall into that typical range. But I think the big question mark is going to be, does it overperform? Do we end up seeing it being a chart breaker on the opposite direction? As we talked about with Top Gun Maverick, that film was out for well over 10 weeks. Because we know that Tom Cruise is very much invested and very much committed to having the movie out in theaters for as long as possible, for as long as Paramount will allow, we can imagine that the film will indeed be available. Now, do they end up changing the rules, or is there a certain metric they have to hit before they can change things and pull things from theaters much sooner than what had initially been anticipated? It's possible. But based on the numbers right now, I don't think it's nearly as bad as what it could be. It's still bad. Again, you're still looking at a film, again, $100+ million of financial losses probably when everything is said and done. And you could argue, and again, I understand the argument and it makes sense financially that they could make a lot of that back on the streaming deals that they'll make for the international releases of the movie. And also they'll make some money back on Blu-ray and 4K sales, etc. But it's not a good position to be in to say, oh, these other things will help pay for our movie that was in and of itself a financial failure at the box office. That's not a good place for it to be. It would much rather be in the position of a film like Barbie, which is looking at hundreds of millions of dollars in profits. But again, not necessarily a great sign for Warner Brothers, because even though this is a good sign as far as, hey, they're going to make some money this year because of how much money their other films have lost. Remember, that $382 million profit, right? That's the current estimate on how much profit that they would actually receive as an individual studio, because they are co-financed with Mattel. Assuming that there's a 50-50 split at $382 million, you're still looking at them only coming away with 160, 170 maybe million, maybe closer to $190 million or so in net profits. When you remember how many hundreds of millions of dollars they've lost this year on their movies, hopefully that shows you a little bit why, yeah, Barbie's doing great individually as a movie, but for a studio, it's better than nothing from Warner Brothers. But Warner Brothers has still more movies coming out this year that will probably end up still adding more and more negative money, more red money to their overall coffers. And so those are the numbers as it stand there. Let me know your thoughts about this and anything else I mentioned in the comment section down below. If you like this video, smash that like button. The farmer asking, smash the rumble button as well. Since my voice is still on the brink of recovery, I'm not yet recording my August shoutouts video. I'll be recording that hopefully over the course of this week, as I am back in school this week. So we'll see how the time frame actually works out for it. But please do be sure to leave your comments below. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless. And now for a special shout out to all of my members at the Keeper of the Bifrost level and above, starting off first with my members over on Patreon: Father Luca Illick, Heimir Irie Hymason, Garrett Searles, Joe Horn, Jonathan Carney, Orange Chat Reviews, check out his YouTube channel by the same name, Laura, the Monomator General's Story, Rosetta Allen, check out her YouTube channel, Eagle Rider, and Miss Martin Muses, check out her YouTube channel by the same name as well. To my Subscribe Star peeps, Zion Voders, Matt317, check out his Twitch channel by the same name, Fast Reaction, The R, Mr. Roy, J-Rod, The Beer Guru, and the K-Man, who you can check out over at xtheboundaries.co. And lastly, to my Locals members, Miss Minnesota Hockey Fan, How About a Hockey Player, J.H. Schwalbach, and Robert Barnes, the amazing lawyer. So thank you all very much for being my supporters at the Keep of the Bifrost level and above. And if you want your name shouted out at the end of every live stream and video, go ahead and check out that top link in the video description below to find out ways to sign up to support support the channel and to be able to get access to things like the shoutouts, but also to giveaways. I have an exclusive giveaways channel on my Discord server where I give away 4Ks, Blu-rays, all kinds of stuff, and also access to an exclusive podcast that I do once or twice a month, depending on what I'm able to get accomplished, especially over the course of this crazy, crazy busy summer. You guys are all amazing and beautiful people. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And as always, God bless.